All right, I'm going to move into a little bit more in the veterinary side of stuff and probably stuff that's not necessarily applicable directly to your situation here. But I think it might be of interest, and you might sort of, when you're translocating, moving animals around or anesthetizing, you might just get some idea of some of the complexity that we need to deal with. So this was a study also that was done by Cindy Broad, which is a French student of mine who did a MSc with me, and a few years ago. I think she's currently still working at a zoo in France. But basically, what I wanted her to do was actually do a survey to try and figure out, at this stage, I'll talk a little bit more about our metapopulation of cheetahs in South Africa and how we move them around. But this is sort of the distribution of cheetahs within southern Africa. Obviously large populations in Namibia and in Botswana. But in South Africa, we only really have absolutely wild populations in the Kruger National Park and in Kalahari National Park, which I'll show you a bit more. Those are the sort of red areas on this side over there and up in the top corner over there. And then in purple over here, you might not be able to see it very clearly, but there are at least 50 or 60 reserves, small reserves in South Africa where cheetahs actually are doing very well at the moment, but we have to move them around from one reserve to the other because obviously they're not connected. We don't want inbreeding, obviously, of those animals, and there's a constant movement of animals backwards and forwards from one reserve to the other. That number, I said it's 330, that's already gone up to about 500 animals at the moment. So we're moving them around almost every week. Animals are moved in South Africa, cheetahs are moved. Now, one of the problems was that since the inception of the project, 114 cheetahs immobilized for translocation and 23 capture-related mortalities were recorded. So that's quite a high mortality rate. Okay, that's number of animals moved around is substantially higher now in the last few years, but I think this was already 2019 or something like that. So that gives you a mortality rate of around 20%, which was really, really high. Most of these animals are being immobilized by fairly experienced wildlife veterinarians. And normally we would find a mortality rate of around 2% to be acceptable. Anything below 2%. So anything above 2% really pretty much unacceptable. This study over here, risk of capture-related mortality in free-ranging mammals. I mean, that's where they looked at in Scandinavia, experiences from Scandinavia, and where we really sort of come up with that sort of 2% threshold. Anything above that, and we really are dealing with a particular problem. Okay, so this was published in the Journal of the South African Veterinary Association. And we surveyed about 75 veterinarians who had done some work on cheetahs. About half of them were from Africa, the others were sort of Asia, Europe, and the USA. And we wanted to basically just get an idea of, was it actual problem with, experience? Did these veterinarians just not have enough experience, or was it an issue, basically to try and figure out, okay, what is going on and what was causing these mortalities? So it was a fairly interesting survey to do. Most of the vets from Africa, because we have private ownership of wildlife, are in private practice, whereas most of the vets from Asia, Europe, and USA were working in zoos. That's fairly, as expected. Interestingly, we looked at when these vets qualified. So, what sort of level of experience do they have? General experience. And we found really that there was quite a good spread all across, some of them qualifying all the way back 1965 and so on. So there is, on the point of retirement, but a good spread, no particular, generation present. When we looked at the number of cheetahs that they'd immobilized in their careers, the African veterinarians certainly had a lot more experience, with some of them having done more than 50 cheetahs in their career. Some of the European ones a little bit more, but had done quite a few, but not nearly as many as the African vets. So quite again, as expected. And then this was just again looking at captive cheetahs immobilized in their career. And African ones, veterinarians had certainly more experience. And this was just looking at the anesthetic complications that were noted at the time. So, they just reported, when they were anesthetizing cheetahs, what did they, did they experience any complications? Many of them didn't experience any problems, 24%. 10% of them had experienced some sort of mortality, death. Hypothermia, so hypothermia is a very high body temperature in the animals. 20% of them experienced that. And then hypothermia, 7%, hypoxemia, which are low blood oxygen levels, respiratory arrest in 10% of the cases, transient seizures in 7%, and then other injuries at lower percentage. So, and then we wanted to find out whether they experienced them regularly or rarely. The ones that they experienced quite commonly were hypothermia and particularly hypoxemia, and those are certainly the things that we would expect them to have experienced. I'll tell you more. In terms of the drug combinations that were used, a wide range of drugs were used in cheetah immobilization. By far the most common combination was medetomidine ketamine, and then followed by medetomidine xylitol or tyletamine xylazepam, but quite a range of different combinations. And we then started looking at whether they were used in a boma or in enclosure, small enclosure, kind of zoo environment, or in a crate. Animals are often transported in crates and then anesthetized whilst they're in the crate. We looked at whether they had been darted from a vehicle or whether they had been darted from a helicopter, which obviously is one of the common ways in which we capture wild cheetahs in South Africa with a helicopter. And so those were the drug combinations. So some of them used a little bit of a different combination depending on the situation, whether they were wild or whether they were captive cheetahs. The top-up drugs, in other words, what do we use if we need to give them additional anesthesia? By far the most common one was ketamine that was given intravenously, and then other things like isoflurane or xylitol or medetomidine ketamine combinations. Interestingly, sort of standard procedures that people followed when anesthetizing cheetahs, did they actually give them oxygen? Most of them didn't. When did they give them intravenous fluids? Very few actually gave them. About 40% gave them IV fluids. Most of them didn't give them additional fluids. This was quite a while back too. Did they get any sort of long-acting tranquilizers during translocation? And some of them were using a bit of midazolam, others using zuclopenthixyl acetate. Most of them giving none, or basically they weren't translocating them, so it wasn't applicable. But I was going to say, we have these kind of either vets or non-vets who actually, say you can never use a long-acting tranquilizer in a cheetah. And that becomes law, and there's no reason given or there's no rationale, it's never explained, and that you can clearly see it in the survey in that they decide, no, you absolutely can't, it's too dangerous to use long-acting tranquilizers during transport of cheetahs because they die. That's a very poor explanation, and it doesn't really explain, what the problems are or under what circumstances or have anything to do with the dose. Maybe it's just the dose that, needs to be changed. But anyway, I'll talk a little about that later. But just to show that sometimes don't believe everything that everybody else tells you. All right, so the normal recording and monitoring of data was done, so that's not too much of an issue. And then in terms of what was monitored, very interestingly, a lot of them monitored the heart rate and the temperature, but very few of them looked at degree of dehydration or did an ECG or the carbon dioxide end-tidal CO2, which is again expected because most of them are not anesthetizing these animals for very long periods of time. So they're usually very quick immobilizations just to move them into a crate or to examine them and so on. And then interestingly, where were they immobilized? So now we get to the actual, sorry, let me just backtrack. Okay, this is now the animals that died. I gathered information on them as to what the circumstances were with regards to the animals that died. So most of these animals, interestingly, died when they were immobilized in the boma or in an enclosure. Some of them from the vehicle, some in the crate or cage when they were immobilized there, and then only 3 of them from the helicopter. Okay, which is kind of not what I was expecting. I was expecting the helicopter, because of the stress and the chase and everything like that, that was going to be more of an issue. But it turned out to be not as big as animals that were darted in the boma. Interestingly, most of those animals that died the reason for immobilization was translocation. Some for health examination, others for collaring, but very few, or a minor procedure. And only 1 animal died whilst under anesthesia for surgery. In terms of the age of the animals, it's not surprising. Most sort of young animals, 2 to 8 years, most of the deaths were in that age category. Again, not surprising. Interestingly, more males, but that died compared to females. But it may be that the males were moved around more often than females, so that may be the reason for that. And then in terms of the time after immobilization, this was very interesting because most of these animals that died had been anesthetized for longer than an hour, but that's quite interesting. I mean, but perhaps expected. The longer the anesthesia, the greater the risks. But what is really, really surprising was the fact that at least 30% of the animals that died had already been given antidotes to reverse. They died after reversing of the drug combination, which is totally unexpected. You'd expect that they would recover after the anesthesia and then have very few complications post-anesthetic or immobilization. What was interesting here was that the temperatures recorded in the animals that died, quite a number of them, 48%, well, that's even higher, it's 50, over 60% of them had a temperature that was higher than 40 degrees Celsius at the time. All right. The drug combinations, although most of the animals that died were immobilized with midatomidine and xylitol, or just xylitol on its own, when we did the statistical analysis, the actual drug combination itself didn't play a role in the actual mortalities. And then just in terms of whether they were given oxygen, vast majority that died were not given oxygen at the time, and not the vast majority, but just more than half of them didn't receive any intravenous fluids. Whether the animals were monitored, whether they put a pulse oximeter on the tongue or something like that to monitor the pulse, the oxygen saturation, the vast majority of them were not actually monitored in that way. So when we used a statistical model on this, we came up with some risk factors. A failure to record and monitor physiological parameters was a risk factor. Partial monitoring without the evaluation of without using pulse oximetry was also a risk factor. And then, very interestingly, protective factors was oxygen supplementation. All right, so regardless of whether the animals, how they were monitored, if they received oxygen, that was a protective factor. And then other things that were not significant were the drug combination used, the amount of experience of the veterinarian, the capture conditions, or in this case, whether or not they developed hypothermia. But it may have just been because of the low numbers of animals or the fact, not the fact that there were low numbers, but the fact that hypothermia was that many of the veterinarians didn't monitor the actual rectal temperature of the animals. That may have been the reason why we didn't pick that up as a risk factor. So basically what we also found through that zoo cheetahs are hardly at risk at all of ever dying under anesthesia. The mortality rate in zoo cheetahs, captive cheetahs, was very, very low. Almost all the cheetahs that died were free-ranging, okay? In other words, wild cheetahs. 62% of those cheetahs that died had a temperature above 40 degrees Celsius. And the biggest risk were the wild cheetahs that were placed in bomas. So very often what happens in South Africa is animals are taken out of a park, a free-ranging situation, captured with a helicopter, moved to a much smaller camp where they can be managed. then what will happen is they will apply for permits to translocate them from one reserve to another whilst they're in the bomas. And because then you want to arrange the transport, it's much easier to capture the animal in a boma. Now you're taking this wild animal, you're putting it into an enclosed space, small space, and the animal is under a high level of stress during that period of time. Now you go back in and you start darting the animal, but usually if it's an individual, a female on her own, that's not too much of a problem. Problem with males is they often occur in coalitions. So you'd have 2, sometimes 3 males together in a boma because you capture them all at the same time. So you dart the first male. Obviously the other animals are with it in the same enclosure when it gets darted. The first male gets darted. So you take the first male out, you dart the second male. By the time you get to the third one, that animal's running up and down. Okay, so firstly, you're going to have trouble darting them, and if you manage to get the dart in, it usually goes subcutaneously, because the animal's moving, goes into the abdomen, animal doesn't go down, you put a second dart into the animal. Now, I mean, you can imagine the build-up of stress over time, all right? So by the time you actually get that animal down, all right, it's already in serious trouble with regards to the amount of adrenaline that's been running through its veins, and we're going to talk a little bit about what happens then physiologically to the animal when you do that. The drug combinations didn't seem to make a significant difference, and I can tell you that I've looked at all the drug combinations that are currently used and looked at what effect they have physiologically on the animals and the cardiorespiratory system. All of them have some negative effect on the cardiorespiratory system and cause some degree of hypoxia, especially when you're at fairly high altitudes. So in South Africa, a lot of our cheetahs are sitting about over 1,000 meters above sea level. All right, so your oxygen concentration at that height, I mean, it's perfectly fine for an animal that's not anesthetized, but as soon as you anesthetize an animal, the concentration of oxygen in the atmosphere is going to play a significant role. It's one of the reasons why you have severe problems if you're transporting some of these animals in a airplane, especially if the hold is not pressurized. All right, so your oxygen levels, you're going up a few thousand feet, and you're already going to have much lower oxygen levels there. That's, again, not going to be a problem for the pilot and people that are completely awake, or cheetahs that will be transported completely awake, but anesthetized animals are going to seriously have a problem. So we find that most of the combinations are going to push your oxygen concentration in the blood down from about 95 down to about 60 millimeters of mercury, in the low 60s. At sea level, they'll probably go into about 70s, which is absolutely fine. They can maintain without any problems with that. But when you've got anything that's going to change oxygen consumption is going to play a serious role when you've got very low oxygen levels in the blood to start with. And all of the drug combinations have the same effect. There's no real one that gives you some better advantage than over the others. In terms of tranquilizers, I think that obviously is something that we're testing at the moment, and we've now started using a water-based perfenazine, which is working really, really well in cheetahs. It's a multipotent blocker, so it works on many different receptors in the body. But the animals it's used for schizophrenic sort of episodes in humans. I mean, a very old drug that's been around for a very long time. And we've used it, the oil-based emulsion for long-acting tranquilization of many game species in South Africa for a long period of time. The only problem with the oil-based one is that it takes a very long time to kick in before it reaches maximal levels in the blood and therefore gets to the brain. So the onset of the sedation is probably somewhere around 24 to 48 hours, and that would be way too long. So now having this water-based one, which is absorbed much faster, okay, we get much better sedation fairly early on, and it lasts a shorter period of time, but for 24 hours, which gives us good time for tranquilization. Okay, so the conclusions really to this that stress was the central thing that was causing most of the actual problems for our cheetahs.